Welcome everybody to our festival program today, and in particular to one of the highlights of the program, this talk by Roman Krznaric. Roman is a public philosopher who writes about the power of ideas to change society, so he fits our bill perfectly. Drawn on his powerful new book, The Good Ancestor, he will discuss how we can redesign democracy for the benefit of current and future generations. His previous books include Empathy, The Wonder Box, and Carpe Diem Regained. He is the founder of the world's first empathy museum and is currently a research fellow at the Long Now Foundation. Roman has been named by The Observer as one of Britain's leading popular philosophers. His writings have been widely influential with political and social campaigners, and we're absolutely delighted to have him in our program, and I hope you enjoy his talk.
So I think it's time for me to start. So hello and good evening to all of you. I'm going to explore some ideas today from a book of mine called The Good Ancestor, How to Think Long-Term in a Short-Term World, and particularly focus on how we can think about redesigning democracy for the generations of the future, as Pete was saying there in that introduction. And the place I'd like to begin really is actually just a few meters away from me in my kitchen. Because in my kitchen, where I live in Oxford in the UK, at the end of 2019, at the time of the last UK general election, my partner and I decided to give our then 11-year-old twins an unusual birthday present. We decided to give them our votes in the election. So we all sat around the kitchen table and we debated the party manifestos, and they then told us where to put the X on the ballot sheet. And in case you're wondering, they didn't exactly follow their parents' political opinions, which was probably a good thing. Now, why did we do this? Well, we did it because it's clear that we live in a world that systematically ignores the interests of the generation upon generation of people who will inhabit the future, including my children and grandchildren and their grandchildren and so on. And I think this is part of a wider problem, which is that I believe we have we're engaged, or we are dominated by the tyranny of the now, the tyranny of the present moment. We know that most of our politicians can barely see beyond, the next election or the latest tweet, that businesses can't see beyond the quarterly report, that markets spike and crash in speculative bubbles, and nations sit around international conference tables bickering away while the planet burns and species disappear. And of course, as individuals, we're constantly looking at our phones and clicking the buy now button. That's what the tyranny of the now is all about. And I think it's equally clear that we need more long-term thinking, to deal with the multiple challenges of our century. We need it to plan for the next pandemic that might be on the horizon. We need to do long-term thinking to deal with racial injustice and wealth inequality that gets passed on from generation to generation. We need to plan for technological risks that might be on the horizon, for example, risks from artificial intelligence or bioweapons. And of course, we need long-term thinking to deal with the global ecological crisis, climate change, biodiversity loss, ocean acidification, and so on. And of course, there's a kind of paradox here that the need for long-term thinking is incredibly urgent. We need it right here, right now. And this evening, I hope to try and unpack that idea a little bit and try and think of concrete ways that we can extend our time horizons, particularly in the political realm. And by the way, I'm going to be talking for about 25 minutes or something like that. And feel free to put as many comments or questions as you like in the chat box. And then Pete will be, or someone will be asking me questions and we can have a bit of discussion. So do feel free to write in anything that you like. Now, if we stand back, the way I think about our relationship with the future, there's not just this tyranny of the now and need for more long-term thinking, but I believe that we've colonized the future, that we treat the future, particularly in wealthy countries, we treat the future like a distant colonial outpost where we can freely dump ecological degradation and technological risk as if there was nobody there. And it's a bit like the way when Britain colonized Australia in the 18th and 19th century. I'm Australian, by the way. When Britain colonized Australia, they drew on a legal doctrine now known as terra nullius. They treated the continent as if there was nobody there. But of course, there was all the indigenous population. And I think today what we have, as well as that legacy of terra nullius, we have what I think of as tempus nullius. We see the future as nobody's time, a similarly uninhabited territory that's ours for the taking. And the tragedy is that future generations can't do anything about this. They can't, leap in front of the king's horse like a suffragette, or they can't block an Alabama bridge like a civil rights protester, or go on a salt march to defy their colonial oppressors like Mahatma Gandhi. They're given no political rights or representation. They have no influence in the marketplace. And I think this problem is sort of summed up quite well by this image you should be able to see there, this cartoon, where you can see there's the crap that we've inherited, like colonial racism. And then there's the our crap, the stuff that we are already dumping on future generations, toxic waste, debt, climate change, and so on. But the attitude is very much that we're going to let the grandkids all sort it out for us. And, of course, it can be quite difficult to really get a sense of that connection with future generations. It's hard to bring them in the room, and that's what this is all about. But if you think about it this way, there are 7.7 billion people alive today, and over the past 50,000 years, an estimated 100 billion people have lived and died in that gray circle, the dead. But over the next 50,000 years, assuming current birth rates level off and stabilize, nearly 7 trillion people will be born. They're in that giant orange circle, and that includes all of your grandchildren and their grandchildren and all the friends and communities on whom they'll depend. And in the next 2 centuries alone, tens of billions of people will be born. And there's a real question about how we are going to be remembered by those future generations for the decisions we made or didn't make when we had the chance. And someone who really thought about this a lot was the immunologist Jonas Salk, who developed the first polio vaccine back in the 1950s. And in later life, he said that there's one great question facing our society today. It's this: are we being good ancestors? In other words, how are we going to be remembered by those generations to come? And he believed that if we were going to be remembered well, and if we were going to tackle the problems of our age, like the destruction of the living world and threats from nuclear waste and so on, then we need to expand our time horizon. So instead of thinking on a scale of seconds, minutes, and hours as we normally do, we needed to think on a scale of decades, centuries, and even millennia. And of course, that's a big challenge. How do we do that? And in my book, The Good Ancestor, I got this diagram you can see there called the Tug of War for Time, which talks about these 6 drivers of short-termism on the one hand, and matched by 6 different ways to think long-term. And some of the drivers of short-termism are very familiar there, things like digital distraction, speculative capitalism. I mean, the one I'm going to be focusing on, that we're talking about really tonight, is about political presentism, that myopia in politics, that incapacity of our political classes to see long term. And what I'm really going to talk about is then, okay, so what do we do about that? And of those 6 ways to think long term, I want to talk just about 3 of them, which I think are particularly important for considering the way to reinvent democracy. And that's intergenerational justice, a legacy mindset, and cathedral thinking. And let me just start with cathedral thinking, which is the idea of making plans and embarking on projects with very long time horizons going forward, decades or even centuries. So embarking on things that you may never see finished within your own lifetime or your own career at least. And of course, it's named after those famous medieval cathedrals in Europe, where people started building them knowing they'd never be finished during their own lifetimes. Greta Thunberg, of course, has said we need cathedral thinking to deal with the climate crisis. Now, cathedral thinking comes in many different forms. So in the top left there, you can see Ulm Minster in southwest Germany, which is a Lutheran church, which was started to be built in 1377 when the good citizens of Ulm decided they wanted to finance their own church. And they didn't finish it for nearly 500 years until the year 1890. So probably the world's longest crowdfunding project. In the bottom left, you can see the civil rights movement in the United States, a recognition that cathedral thinking is also something that comes out of, or it's expressed by, social and political movements that have very long time horizons, because people engaged in social movements know they're not normally going to achieve their aims in just a few months or years. Something like the civil rights movement or movements of women's rights sometimes take decades and even longer. So they need long-term vision. And on the right, you can see an image of the sewers built in London in the Victorian period, which is another great cathedral thinking project, or really a sewer thinking project, might call it, where, as you may know, after the great stink of 1858, where, up until then, raw sewage was being dumped in the Thames, tens of thousands of people each year were dying of cholera. But the stench was so bad in 1858, in that long hot summer, that even members of parliament couldn't breathe in Westminster, and they had to cover their faces with masks, as they're doing now. And that's when they finally passed the emergency legislation to build the sewers over a period of nearly 20 years, 22,000 workers, 318 million bricks. But the amazing thing about the sewers is they were built twice as big as they needed to be. And that's why they are still in use today. Because of that kind of long-term cathedral thinking, or sewer thinking, as I call it. So we clearly have this capacity to think for the long term and not only be looking at our phones. And there are a lot of modern versions of this too. Or, there are scientific projects like the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, which is collecting millions of seeds in an indestructible rock bunker in the Arctic Circle that's designed to last for 1,000 years. So this is an incredibly impressive long-term project. And I think all of these kinds of projects are very inspiring. They show that we do have a capacity to think and plan for the long term. But of course, cathedral thinking isn't always good for us. We have to recognize it can be put to very narrow and self-serving ends. So, for example, the regime in North Korea wants to preserve its power and privilege for generation upon generation. That's a kind of cathedral thinking. Or in the corporate world, you get it, a very narrow and self-serving form of cathedral thinking too. A former head of Goldman Sachs, Gus Levy, said we're greedy, but long-term greedy, not short-term greedy. And we need to think, how do we do a kind of long-term thinking or cathedral thinking that goes beyond this sort of narrow self-serving version, do something that's much more inclusive, that really represents or gives voice to all those future generations which we know are out there. And that brings me on to the second way to think long-term, having looked at cathedral thinking, the idea of intergenerational justice. And this is about, ultimately trying to give voice to those future generations. I mean, Groucho Marx famously said, why should I care about future generations? What have they ever done for me? And I think intuitively, we often feel that, right? I've got enough problems in my own life, maybe a family tragedy due to COVID, or I've lost my job. We have immediate issues to deal with, but equally we know that there are all those billions of people, those future generations to come. And there's a question about how do we give them voice? Because we know our actions have never had such an impact on future generations through history. We are dumping so much, as I said earlier, on the future. What do we do about it? And one of the really fascinating things that's happened in the last 10 or 20 years is that governments around the world and political systems around the world have been finding ways to give voice or represent the interests of future generations in lots of different creative ways. And I want to just talk about 4 of them, which I discuss in my book: the idea of guardians for the future, citizens' assemblies, intergenerational rights, and the idea of self-governing city-states, or radical devolution, really. And these are all principles of what I think of as deep democracy. These are ways to, in a way, inject, long-term thinking and intergenerational justice into the DNA of democracy itself. And the first form I talk about, like to say something about, is the idea of a guardian for the future. And that's an idea almost sort of goes back to Plato, the idea that somebody could be there representing future generations of political position. And these actually exist. Probably the best known is that in Wales, they have a future generations commissioner. And there's a photo of there, you can see her name's Sophie Howe. And her job is to look at the impact of public policy in healthcare, education, environment, all sorts of areas on future generations up to about 30 years in the future. Now, as Sophie Howe will say herself, she doesn't have a lot of power. She really has mostly the power to name and shame, but she's being able to sort of punch above her weight, as it were, through doing her job really well. And the idea of future generations commissioner is sort of taking off in different places. So you may know that there's actually a campaign for the whole UK to have a future generations commissioner. In fact, there's a bill before Parliament at the moment. It was It was submitted as a private member's bill by Lord John Bird, who founded the Big Issue magazine. And that's a bill that would actually give the Future Generations Commissioner more power than the one they have in Wales. So I think it's a kind of a good thing. But as my kids have said to me, they said, look, why should I trust a political appointee, this one person to look after my interests? And what about when you've got very diverse communities with different views? Aren't there a plurality of futures to think about? And so I think the Future Generations Commissioner or Guardian is a sort of a first step in thinking about how to bring a bit of long-termism into democracy. Another way is to engage in the legal sphere. And this is an area where there's been really important advances made. So the image you can see there is from a legal organization, in fact, a public interest law firm in the United States called Our Children's Trust, which has launched a landmark case against the US federal government on behalf of the 21 young people you can see there who are campaigning for the legal right to a safe climate and healthy atmosphere for both current and future generations. So they've sued the federal government as well as state governments as well, for example, the way that governments are subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. And in a way, this is one of the most exciting, I think, advances in rights since the French Revolution, giving rights to future generations. And there are many of these legal struggles popping up around the world. So recently, 6 young people in Portugal sued 33 European countries for failing to meet their climate change targets. And this movement, Our Children's Trust, has inspired other legal cases in the Netherlands, in Uganda, in Kenya, and in Colombia as well. But alongside these campaigns to give rights to future people, there are campaigns to give rights to the living world as well. So in New Zealand, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, a river, the Wanganui River, which is sacred to local Maori people, has been given the rights of a person in the same way that corporations were given rights at the end of the 19th century. This is now happening with the living world. So that's sort of struggles in the legal sphere. And then a third area I mentioned, you saw in that earlier slide, was the idea of citizens' assemblies as a way of injecting long-termism into democracy. And let me give you just one example, which you can see there. This is a movement called Future Design, which is based in Japan, and it's directly inspired by the Native American idea of 7th generation decision-making, a kind of a cosmovision of ecological stewardship, thinking about making decisions 7 generations ahead. They don't quite go 7 generations ahead, but they go quite far. So what Future Design does is it invites local people to discuss and draw up plans for the towns and cities where they live in Japan. And they typically divide people into 2 groups. Half of them are told that they're residents from the present day. And the other half are given these ceremonial robes to wear, these orange robes you can see there, and told to imagine themselves as residents from the year 2060. And I don't know if you can see me in the camera as well, but I'm holding up, I've actually got one of these fantastic robes that they gave me as a gift. And it turns out that when you're dressed up with your robe from 2060, those residents come up with far more transformative long-term plans for their towns and cities, whether it's healthcare investment or action on climate change. And this future design movement has been spreading from small towns, like the photo there is from a small town of say 30,000 people, Yahaba, but it's also being used in big cities like Kyoto and even in Japan's Ministry of Finance. And they've had a lot of very concrete results. I mean, there are towns, for example, where initially nobody wanted to pay higher taxes for investment in the town's crumbling water infrastructure. But after doing future design, the town voted for a 6% rise in water rates because they knew that this was going to benefit their children and their grandchildren. And something else that's happened really interestingly in Japan is that with future design, there's a Japanese city of Uji, which in fact is almost exactly the same size as Belfast. And the town council started doing future design, but then the citizens themselves, after this process was finished, set up their own future design assembly. And they now invite the local councillors to come along while they discuss the future of the city. So I think this is a kind of model which you could easily export to Belfast or other cities or around the world. You could design your own gowns, but it's really based on that citizen assembly model, which of course has been very successful in the Republic of Ireland, in Spain, in Belgium and other places. It's about injecting deliberative democracy into decision-making processes, but adding on this extra bit of long-term time horizons. And then the fourth area I'd just like to mention briefly is the idea of radical decentralization as a way of thinking longer term or achieving better long-term policy results. And the image I've got there is a slightly playful image I've got in my book, Reimagining Europe as City-States. And I'm sorry that Belfast isn't there, because this has only areas up to 1 million people or more. And I think Belfast is about 250,000 or a bit more than that. But what it's actually telling us is that, or the point I really want to make is that actually it's that the cities are really, really good at long-term planning, particularly compared to large nation states. If you think about, when Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement in 2017, 279 US city mayors said, no, we are going to stick with the Paris Agreement and staying below 1.5 degrees. Then they represent nearly 1 in 5 Americans, tens of millions of people from big cities like Miami and Boston. And, cities we see embracing long-term thinking in all sorts of innovative ways. In Amsterdam, for example, which you can see on the image there, they've really embraced the circular economy movement, for example, a sort of no-waste economy. They're going to be 50% circular by 2030, no fossil fuel cars after 2030, really ratcheting up their targets in an impressive way. So those are sort of 4 ways I think we can start bringing more long-termism into democratic structures. But I think it's really important that we hold governments to account, that we're able to almost sort of rate how good governments are at their long-term public policy. And in fact, in my book, I do this with the help of something called the Intergenerational Solidarity Index, which is developed by a great Scottish statistician called Jamie McQuilkin. And what it does is it's ranked 122 countries on their long-term public policy performance across 10 different indicators. So economic indicators like wealth inequality, social ones like long-term investment in health and education, environmental ones like reforestation, renewable energy, and it puts them all together in a single score, averages them out. And you can see there the rankings of the top 24 countries, Iceland, Sweden, some non-wealthy countries too, like Nepal or Costa Rica, Sri Lanka in there as well. The UK as a whole is way down the list, only number 45 out of 122 countries. The US is 62nd. And every country could be getting or doing better on this Intergenerational Solidarity Index. So I'd like to see maybe this measure or something like it being used to hold governments to account, whether it's the regional, devolved level or at the national level too. But one challenge I've sometimes got around this idea of injecting long-termism into democracy, sometimes people say to me, they say, look, wouldn't it be just a lot easier if we just got rid of democracy and actually just brought in a benevolent dictator just to sort everything out for us? Just think about China's long-term investment in renewables, or think about somewhere like Singapore. Yes, they may give up some civil and political rights, but they've got this great long-term investment in healthcare and education. Let's just bring in the benign dictators to sort it out, because all those squabbling politicians are just focused on their near-term interests. Well, it's an interesting argument to think about, isn't it? And it intrigued me when I came across it, partly because I used to be a political scientist years ago, back in the 1990s. I was apparently an expert on democracy, and one of the things was it never even occurred to me at that time that we failed to give rights to future generations or represent their interests. But one thing I did get into was the idea of measuring democracies. And this got me intrigued in this question: is it actually true that authoritarian governments are better at long-term planning policy than democracies are? What's the actual evidence? And so I drew up this little diagram here. I'll just explain it to you quickly. Along the bottom axis, the x-axis going along the bottom, is the score on this Intergenerational Solidarity Index. So a higher score means more long-term thinking. And up the left-hand side, going upwards on the y-axis, is a measure of how democratic countries are. It's a very famous one. It's called VDEM. And it's about whether you've got free and fair elections and things like that. And what the data shows, looking at 122 countries, of the 25 highest scoring countries on the Intergenerational Solidarity Index, 21 of them are democracies, and of the 25 lowest scoring countries, 21 of them are authoritarian governments, monarchies, military dictatorships, and so on. So what that basically tells you is that more democracy means more long-term thinking. China and Singapore are kind of exceptions to the rule. So I think there are really strong arguments for trying to expand democratic decision-making through those methods I've talked about, like citizens' assemblies, like guardians of the future. But I think we also just need to just stand back for a moment and think, remember what this is all about. Why do we care about this issue in intergenerational justice? And this has to do with developing a legacy mindset. I'm just going to speak for a few more minutes and then we've got time for questions. And the idea of a legacy mindset is going back to that Jonas Salk idea of being remembered well by those future generations. And let's think about the legacies we've inherited from the past. We've inherited very positive legacies, like legacies of medical discoveries we still benefit from, like the polio vaccine, for example, but we're also the inheritors of negative legacies, legacies of slavery and colonialism and racism, creating deep inequities that must now be transformed, legacies of economies that are structurally addicted to fossil fuels and endless growth that we now need to transform as well. And how do we go about doing that? How do we pass on something better to those generations of the future, particularly when it's so hard to really picture them? And I'd like you to just picture those future generations for a moment by accompanying me in a little imaginative exercise. What I'd like you to do is just to close your eyes for a moment. Wherever you are, sitting in your sitting room, in your kitchen, wherever you are, close your eyes for a moment. And I just want you to bring into your mind's eye, just imagine a young person in your life who you really care about. It could be a nephew or niece or one of your own kids or grandchildren. Just picture their face with your eyes shut for a moment. And now, with your eyes still closed, imagine them 30 years in the future. Think about the joys they're facing, the suffering they might be facing, the struggles in their life. Just sit with that thought for a moment and picture what they look like too 30 years from now. And now I would like you to finally, still with your eyes shut, imagine this person on their 90th birthday party. They're 90 years old, they're surrounded by family and friends and loved ones and old work colleagues and neighbors. Now just go and have a look at the window. Look out the window. What kind of world is it out there? And then you notice somebody come and put a baby into their arms. It's their first great-grandchild. And then this 90-year-old is about to give a birthday speech, and suddenly they see a photograph of you, their departed ancestor, over on the mantelpiece, and decide to tell the gathered room about the legacy that you left them and the world that they live in. Just think for a moment in silence about what they said about you and the legacy that you left them. And now I'd just like you to open your eyes again. And I recognize that that kind of exercise can be quite confronting and challenging, particularly if you've got a dark vision of the future, but it is one way of connecting with future generations. And certainly when I do it, I think about my daughter, now 12 years old, as a 90-year-old, maybe she'll be alive in the year 2100. That future isn't science fiction. It's an intimate family fact. If I care about her life, what I've learned from this kind of exercise is I need to care about all life because she's not alone in the world. Like that little baby you can see on the screen floating in space. She's surrounded in the future by her family and friends and loved ones, and also the living world too, the air she breathes and the water she drinks. So if I care about her life, I need to care about all life. And there's all sorts of ways and great projects for helping us think about the legacies we're going to leave to all of these future generations. Let me just give you one of these. This is an art project called Future Library from the Scottish artist Katie Patterson, where every year for a century, a famous writer is donating a book which will remain completely secret and unread in the Future Library until the year 2114, when the 100 books will be printed on paper made from 1,000 trees which have been planted in a forest outside Oslo. And the first person to donate a book was Margaret Atwood. The Turkish writer Elif Shafak have donated books. And these are all about what they're doing is donating books they'll never see read in their lifetimes, but books which are kind of gifts to future generations. And we can all ask ourselves what gifts we want to leave to the future, and ultimately sit with this idea of seventh generation decision making, which I think is so powerful. Here's a beautiful quote I just want to finish with from Chief Oren Lyons from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, sometimes known as the Iroquois people. He says this: "We are looking ahead, as is one of the first mandates given us as chiefs, to make sure that every decision we make relates to the welfare and well-being of the seventh generation to come. And that is the basis by which we make decisions in council. Will this be to the benefit of the seventh generation?" And I think there's all sorts of ways we can start honoring those future generations in our politics. And I think if we have the courage and creativity to do so, we will become the future generation, the good ancestors that future generations deserve. And with that, I'd like to stop. And I hope that you have lots of questions, which I think you can put in the chat. I'm not sure how this works, or if Pete is going to be joining me on the screen. And thank you for those people I can see applauding just in the in the strip. So what happens now? Does somebody come to join me or to look at the questions? Or just for a start, while we're waiting, because I'm not sure how this is organized, please put any questions that you have in the chat box below, and I'd love to see them. Do ask about anything, or write down your favorite long-term thinking project that you might find inspiring. And I hope you are typing away there with questions for me. In fact, I'm going to put it on gallery view so I can see everybody. And please ask questions about any aspect of this that I've been talking about. Okay. I can, oh, here, okay, here we have a question, first one from James Mulligan. Do you have any tips or advice for organizing citizens' assemblies? Oh, all the questions are coming in now. Oh my God, there's lots of them. Okay, let's see if I can keep an eye on all of this. It's great, I love it. Okay, well, let's just look at this. Let me just sort of go through them from the top, and let's see how we go. So do I have any tips or advice for organizing citizens' assemblies? And let's link it to the second one, which is, what practical examples have you got of municipalities bringing that creativity that's needed into their decision-making processes? Well, you know, I'm no expert on organizing citizens' assemblies, but I was recently taking part in one in the north of Tyne, so in the sort of Northumberland area, and I was brought in as an expert kind of to talk about thinking about future generations. And I mean, what I've discovered from at least my small experience of citizens' assemblies is, they're really important. I think they're a really vital way for us to start rethinking democracy, because one of the problems with democracy isn't just that there's this short-termism. We also know that across the Western world, there's declining faith in traditional parties and politics, and the rise of far-right populism. This is sense that the sort of elites at the center aren't representing or listening to people's voices. So citizens' assemblies are a really great way of introducing, you know, the ancient Greek idea of participatory democracy, you know, but extending the franchise to more than just, you know, men, you know, because of course the Greeks didn't have women, slaves, or immigrants getting any say in it at all. So I think that's something that's really important about citizens' assemblies, that it's reviving democracy, its participatory nature, as well as injecting long-termism, because there's really good evidence that citizens' assemblies actually tend to take a longer view, because those people who are taking part in something that's really like an intergenerational jury aren't caught up in those same short-term cycles. They're not thinking about elections or corporate funding and stuff like that. But I would say that, again, with my small experience of this, is that citizens' assemblies can be, because the way they work is, the idea is to make them very representative. So you make sure you've got people of different age group and ethnic backgrounds and so on. They can be quite expensive to run. and set up and make sure that people actually turn up and are engaged. And if you talk to people who organize citizen assemblies, it's hard work and you need good facilitators to make them work really well. But I think we're just learning to get good at this. And I think the places to look for the really experienced examples of this are in Belgium and Spain, where they're really good at running these citizens assemblies. And there's lots of great documentation you can find around that. Let's go down to the next question here. What would be your greatest something to your 12-year-old daughter? I think there's a missing word there from Roz. Maybe greatest legacy to your 12-year-old daughter? Roz, are you able to write in the missing word if you're still there? Otherwise, I'm going to guess what it might be. Let's say, what would be your greatest legacy to your 12-year-old daughter? I tell you what just first comes to mind, which is slightly our greatest gift, she's just said, greatest gift to your daughter. That's really interesting. Well, I have gifted her my vote. So that's one starting point. Actually, a gift that she gave me on my 50th birthday recently. This is relevant, by the way. On my 50th birthday, some weeks ago, I went with my kids and my partner to visit this ancient tree in a churchyard outside Oxford. And it's a tree that's nearly 900 years old. And we climbed into the tree because we went and had a picnic in its branches. And that was all about getting in touch with deep time. Because of course I was talking to the kids about how that tree had witnessed the English Civil War in the 17th century, or had been there during the Black Death in the 14th century. And we need to expand our sense of time and realize, I guess, that we've only been here for an eye blink in the cosmic story. And who are we to have wrought such destruction in just the last couple of 100 years? And so if I think about, what are the kind of gifts that I'm leaving to my daughter? I think it's really about values. Of course, I want to leave family heirlooms or pass on culture and traditions, but, maybe, money as well, or a home or something like that. But really, it's the values, I think, that matter. And if I feel I can pass on values about empathy, about the capacity to step in people's shoes, both in today's world and tomorrow's world, I think I will have given her some kind of reasonable gift. But of course, my kids are giving me gifts all the time. And I think it really runs that way around. When my kids, say to me, oh, what about that Future Generations Commissioner idea? Why should I trust that person to look after my interests? Or all the different things that I learn off them. And also because they're ecological natives. As our daughter said to us the other day, she said, why do we still have a fossil fuel car? This is ridiculous. And so in fact, we recently just got rid of our car, got it recycled, have joined the local electric car club, because luckily where I live, there's electric cars, there's a cooperative, and that's fantastic. So that's our kids giving gifts to us in many ways. Let's have a look at the next question here. Thank you. I think democracy has two big challenges, says Ian. The first, as you say, is the factor is the needs for future generations. The second is how we keep pathology out of power. Have you got any comments on how these might be tackled together? Oh, that's a tricky question. How am I supposed to answer that? What do I think about that? I mean, maybe I'm going to just sound like I'm repeating myself, but I think the citizen assembly idea is one way of doing that, because what you need to do is drain power, I think, and devolution as well. I think we need to be draining power away from the center. I think those are the ultimate ways that we deal with the pathology of power. In fact, if I just bring down a book I happen to have on my shelf here, Anarchy in Action by Colin Ward. Now, this is a book, a lot of people think of anarchism as about, blowing up, terrorists, blowing up Russian SARS, but this is a different form of anarchism. This is about anarchy as a form of social organization. It was written in the 1970s. And Colin Ward's point is that we are organizing ourselves all the time. He's written lots of books about allotments, for example, the way people share seeds, they organize themselves, cooperative movements. There's all sorts of ways in which at the local level, we're really good at organizing our lives to do really important things. And I think in a way, the more we devolve power away, the more we're going to be dealing with those pathologies of power. I mean, I think that's a bit of a, not probably a detailed enough answer for Ian. I'm sure Ian has all his own really good thoughts on that. In fact, am I allowed to bring, I don't know if I'm allowed to ask people to say anything, if you can turn on your mics, but Ian, if you are there, do you want to say something about your thoughts on this?
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I hear you fine.
Oh, great. Yeah, so I love the talk, Roman. Thank you very much. So it's an area of interest for me. So I've written a book about disordered minds, how dangerous personalities are destroying democracy, about psychopaths and narcissists and so forth. And I think your answer is a really great one, because it is about draining the power from the center, as you say. The more concentrated power is, then the more these individuals and like-minded individuals and groups are able to seize. So I was also struck, I was glad you said about North Korea, because I was also struck about when you talk about cathedral thinking or long-term thinking, there's also a danger in that. If you think about Hitler and the Third Reich, and you think about Mao, what Mao was thinking and the great project for communism about future generations, but sacrificing present generations in order to get there. So I think draining the center is absolutely central to it. But maybe there's something more to be thought about, because I think democracy is failing at the moment in precisely that. If you look around the world, I think there's a lot of these individuals who are getting into power on the back of populist movements. So I think it's a question we have to think urgently about, and what defenses can we use to stop these individuals from getting into power and being voted into power perhaps by majorities. So thanks again.
Well, thanks for those thoughts, Ian. And yeah, that, of course, Hitler wanted a 1,000-year Reich. And I think that rise of right-wing populism is a really challenging issue. But something actually I've just been researching a little bit today by chance is that the rise of authoritarian tendencies amongst the global ecological movement as well. People who are on the sort of green left and other places who think, we need a kind of like a green dictator to sort out all our problems for us. And I think that comes out of places of anxiety and insecurity, and as well as sort of other pathologies in society, like the idea that, a good king will come along and save us, like Aragorn, son of Arathorn in the Lord of the Rings, or Jon Snow in Game of Thrones. I mean, there's a lot of that in society, maybe even Black Panther. But let me look down the next questions. For the past, okay, here's John. For the past year, we've gone from lockdown to lockdown under the tyranny of the R rate, right? Not just the tyranny of the now. Even as we work till we come out of this, the government are trying to put in place policies to prevent people assembling in any way that they don't like. What can we do about this? Right, this is just like a whole class on politics in general. I love it. It's interesting. What that makes me think about is the nature of crises. In a way, if I was going to sort of rewrite this book, The Good Ancestor, or do anything different, now it's sort of all the COVID stuff is happening, I'd probably write a little bit more about the problem of crisis and how we respond to them. Because on one level, a lot of incredible long-term thinking has come out of crises. If you think about the Second World War, right, out of the ashes of the war came the World Health Organization and the European Union and the National Health Service in the UK and so on. But crises can go in different directions. I mean, if you go back a little bit further to the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression, well, that took some countries towards social democracy, like in Scandinavia. And in other countries, it took them towards fascism. And I think, I remember when the coronavirus first struck, one of the things I was particularly worried about, and I think we're seeing that, is the idea of a kind of authoritarian residue coming out of it, that, countries and leaders who have used emergency powers to deal with the crisis, use that as an excuse to hold on to those powers and not let them go after the crisis has gone. And I think we're seeing an element of this as in John's comment there about people, trying to prevent people from assembling. This is a really great time to introduce for a government to try and stop people assembling, to say, oh no, you're going to be spreading COVID and so on. And I think we need to keep our eye on that, absolutely on that. And I think we need to be taking to the streets against that, because, ultimately, I think one of the challenges of all of this, and I think a kind of critique in a way of some of the suggestions I've put about democracy, is that, look, this is all just going to take too long. We don't have enough time, particularly around climate crisis, to have a 50-year-long legal process to give rights to future generations in the US or in other countries. We also actually need to have people on the streets, direct action. Historically, this is how transformative change has happened. So yeah, I think that what do we do about those policies being to prevent people from assembling? Well, you assemble in a way. I think that's actually one of the things that you do. Okay, let's see. We've got the next point here from Mark. Can a legacy I haven't looked through these questions, so they're coming as a surprise to me as I read each word. Here we go. Can a legacy mindset cope with a world parliament idea? For example, at democracywithoutborders.org, thinking global as well as local citizens. Citizens' assemblies could be a good way to feed the long-term agenda for UN Parliamentary Assembly. Wow, we're going from the local to the very, very global. And that's a really interesting point, because over the last, actually probably the last 50 years, there have been movements for the idea of a world parliament. In fact, I've got a book on it right around the corner here, if I can find it. Book by the British environmental writer George Monbiot called The Age of Consent, a manifesto for a new world order. That's all about founding a world parliament. Now, of course, the world parliament idea is a kind of tricky one in terms of legitimacy and corruption, and will it be more long-term than anything else? In fact, the other day I was in a meeting with the head of the United Nations Development Program, and we're talking about the future of global development. And one of the things I was suggesting was the idea of there being not a world parliament, but a UN special rapporteur for future generations. So it's like there's a special rapporteur on human rights and extreme poverty and indigenous rights. Why not have one on future generations? Now, I know that's not a world parliament, because this special rapporteur would be an appointed position. But I think these are some of the kinds of innovative mechanisms that we need. When it comes to a world parliament, what do I really think about that? I'm not 100% wedded to that idea, partly because I think so much of the future is in cities, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. I mean, if you think back to the Hanseatic League in the 15th, 16th century across Europe, that was an interdependent grouping of over 200 Northern European cities, really, that cooperated in terms of trade. And actually, I think now we could create something similar, but with the world's biggest cities, like a kind of not diplomacy, but diplomacity, as it has been called. And there's an organization called the C40, which brings together nearly 100 cities, which are all cooperating around climate change. So again, that's not a world parliament, but that's a kind of a global form of organization, which I think can help us move into the long term. But ultimately, yeah, if we could make a UN Parliamentary Assembly really work, and the problem would be it might be a bit like the European Union, where people don't turn out, and there's a lot of voter apathy and so on. Unless they've got real power, it's going to be hard for it to be really legitimate. Next question was, wow, what kind of tree was it? It was a yew tree, an 850-year-old yew tree. But there's plenty of, there are trees in the White Mountains in California, bristlecone pines that live for nearly 5,000 years. So you can get a lot better than a yew tree. And there's even a tree in Japan. What is it called? I can't remember. It's got a special name, but it's nearly 7,000 years old. And if you're interested in this stuff, just to go a bit random, there's a brilliant website called The Oldest Living Things in the World. And it's a photography project by an American photographer called Rachel Sussman, Sussman. And what she did is she spent 10 years photographing living things that were over 2,000 years old. So mosses that were 3,000 years old, trees that were 5,000 years old. Absolutely amazing project. Okay, next question here from Stevie. Keynes thought that we all would be working a 15-hour week, yet working for most people has gone up with less security. How does AI fit with this in the context of capitalism that maintains the tension between labor and capital? Oh my God, I'm going to read that again so I can get it into my head. Keynes thought that we were all working 15-hour week. Yes, he wrote this famous essay called Economic Prospects for Our Grandchildren or something like that. It was very popular in the 20s and 30s. People like Bertrand Russell and others thought, right, we're going to have so much leisure time in the future, that we'll just be able to work 4-hour weeks, that the economic progress will benefit us so much. Because what Keynes didn't see was that we were going to keep buying shit that we didn't need. We're going to be sold stuff that we didn't need. In fact, I don't know why I'm pulling out a lot of books today, just because I'm having a nice time. Here's a really good book on that, which is Ways of Seeing by John Berger, right? Written in the 1970s as well, which is all about how we buy stuff we don't really need. That's what Keynes and Bertrand Russell and all those people didn't see, that consumer society, which is going to keep us working and working and working and working. And hopefully what I've said there might provide an answer to the question. So as Stevie then says, yeah, working hours, most people have gone up with less security. Absolutely. How does AI, so artificial intelligence, fit with this context of capitalism that maintains a tension between labor and capital? I don't really know the answer to that. I mean, I think there's one kind of question here about the impacts of automation and technology. I mean, there's always been the historical argument that new technologies that we think are going to take jobs away actually don't, because they create new jobs. But certainly in the books that I've been reading recently on this theme, particularly a great book by Max Tegmark called Life 3.0, the evidence seems to suggest that the shift towards AI of all sorts of kinds is going to have massive impacts on employment. And a lot of people dream of a world of universal basic income and so on. Well, I mean, I think that's, though they are really important experiments in some places and I support them, I think it's a little bit of a pipe dream where we're not even providing basic social services to people. And I think this tension between labor and capital that AI and automation in general are going to cause is just going to get more and more extreme. There's going to be more and more insecurity. And that raises another question, which I think is really important here, which I don't know if someone has maybe asked it later down, but I'm going to ask it to you myself anyway, which is, some people say to me, look, the problem with long-term thinking is that if you're in a position of insecurity, like a refugee, or you're just trying to put food on the table, well, how much long-term thinking can you really do? And I think that's a very legitimate question. When my father was a refugee from Poland to Australia after the Second World War, he was just trying to live in the moment, make ends meet. But one of the interesting things I found in my research about long-term thinking is that often it's people at the socioeconomic margins who are really skilled at long-term thinking and really dedicated to it. If you think, for example, of Native American communities, certainly they are not in the socioeconomic upper echelons, yet they're the ones who are talking about seventh generation thinking, or Maori communities in Aotearoa, New Zealand. In fact, just this morning, I was thinking about refugees. Imagine that, you see those photos of refugee parents in a boat crossing the Mediterranean. Well, they're thinking about the future. Despite all the insecurity they're facing, they're thinking about, I want to give a better life for my children and their children. They're thinking decades ahead, even though they're facing immediate challenges of all sorts of kinds. I'm going to move on to the next question, because that question was actually a bit too difficult for me, but I'll think about it more. Connor asking, is there an example within the current political system of a particular political party acting with long-term good ancestor thinking? What's the answer to that question? I think in the UK context, it's really hard to answer, because of course there are parties which have great long-term policies, but they don't have any power. So the Green Party, for example, has worked with the new economic model of donut economics, which some of you may know about, developed by the British economist Kate Raworth. Imagine a donut with a hole in the middle, where the inner circle is what's called the social foundation. And these are based on the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, where the idea is to bring people above a basic social, meeting basic social needs and rights, like in terms of education and healthcare and income. But the outer edge of the donut is what's called the ecological ceiling, made of 9 planetary boundaries, things like CO2 emissions or biodiversity loss, ocean acidification. The idea of the donut economics model is to bring people above the social foundation without pushing our economies beyond the outer ceiling, the ecological ceiling. And most governments, of course, are still wedded to the old idea of constant economic growth, as governments left, right, and center have been around the world since the end of the Second World War. But there are progressive governments and parties which have adopted models like the donut, because our economies can't keep growing forever. We're using 1.6 planet Earths each year. If you have a long-term view, this is a kind of madness. And so you've got parties like the Green Party in the UK that's very into the donut, but actually I mentioned Amsterdam a little bit earlier, and Amsterdam as a city has adopted the donut as part of its post-COVID recovery program. So all its circular economy ideas, all its ambitions around getting rid of fossil fuels and so on is based on that donut economics model. And what's interesting about Amsterdam and also Copenhagen, that's also adopted the donut model, is you've got parties across the political spectrum embracing it because it's a good general model. It doesn't necessarily tell you exactly what policies you need to get into that space above the social foundation within the ecological ceiling. So you've even got some in Copenhagen on the city level, some more right-wing parties which are saying, oh, okay, I think we can work with this. We can at least put it on the table, and when we're making our budgets and so on, let's try and be consistent with this. So that's where I would, how I would answer that. Okay, a big comment from Louise. We haven't got much more time left. 3 more minutes. Here we go, but I'm happy to go on. Right. Okay. Louise says, we are growing participatory budgeting here, and I'm really excited about how youth participatory budgeting can start to engage younger people and give them a voice and a genuine say about the present and the future. Do you have any advice for us on good examples of youth participatory budgeting and empowering younger people like that which you gave, giving the gift of the vote? And what are your thoughts on when younger people should be able to vote? A huge area for change. Okay. On participatory budgeting, I'm no expert on this. I mean, clearly, there are lots of progressive places which have adopted it, famously Porto Alegre in Brazil, where it's been very successful. And I think, to make a general comment about this, I think these kinds of deliberative processes where you're engaging your citizens, whether it is something like that future design movement in Japan or participatory budgeting or digital democracy that you've got in Madrid, things like that, there is so much scope for including young people in these processes. There's no reason why teenagers should not be part of these processes at all, as far as I can see. Now, that links to the question of voting. When should we give kids the vote? Look, okay, I gave my votes to my kids, but in a way that was a symbolic gesture, because I know that even if you lowered the voting age to 16, as it happens in some countries, or 17 in other places, if your politicians are still caught in short-term cycles, it's not going to do much good necessarily. That you can give a vote to someone who's 16, but if your politicians are still dealing, meeting the needs of short-term needs of corporate funders, if they're still having to respond to the opinion polls, it may not necessarily help very much. Now, I do think it's a good thing to lower the voting age, because clearly there are issues like Brexit where the over 65s had one view of Brexit and the under 30s had a totally different view. And who's going to be living in that future world? Well, it's the younger people, of course. But when I've looked at the evidence of whether lowering voting age actually increases long-term public policy, I haven't seen concrete evidence of it yet. And that evidence might be there. It's more an intuitive thing. I would say, yes, let's lower that vote. But actually, the real place to bring in young people are, I think, particularly in those things like citizens' assemblies, participatory budgeting. I'm sorry, I don't have any more concrete examples. Let's have one more question. Let's just see. Okay, what's the next one? From Peter M. Do you ever encounter the mindset of, well, previous generations have left us with lots of problems, so why should we worry about leaving a good legacy for the next generation? It's every generation's for themselves. What do you think about that? And, it's a good point, and it's worth thinking about, because, well, I guess the way I think about this is with respect to the idea of the golden rule. Now, almost every religion and ethical system has come up with some version of the golden rule. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. But you can extend that idea. When we think of the golden rule, we normally think of it in today's world. How can I treat somebody else how I'd want to be treated? Somebody who's sleeping on the streets or who's suffering in some way, whatever it is. But we can also extend the golden rule through time. So let's treat future generations how we would want past generations to have treated us. Now, I'm personally pleased with some of the things that have been passed on to me by past generations, like those medical discoveries. But I am, my kids, for example, are really unhappy about the fossil fuel economy that's been passed on to them, knowing that we've had knowledge of the impacts of the ecological crisis at least since the early 1990s, and yet there's been no actions. And But I think for my kids, it doesn't generate in them a sense of, well, I'm just going to dump on the next generation myself, or let's keep passing on the crap, you know. In a way, I think this is about a fundamental question about democracy, actually. It's about the demos. Who are the people, you know? And we think of the demos in democracy, the people, as people who are in today's world. But actually, there's all the people in tomorrow's world as well. Why shouldn't they be given a voice? Why shouldn't we hear what they have to say? Why shouldn't we try and imagine their interests? We don't know what the world they're going to live in necessarily. Look, I don't know if the year 2049 is going to be like Blade Runner 2049 and the machines have taken over, right? We don't know that much about a lot of technological impacts in the future. What we do know is about the ecological impacts. We know that it's business as usual. We'll be in a world of 3 to 4 degrees heating by 2100 and 1 to 2 meters of sea level rises. We don't know exactly how much, but we know that's the world we're going to. We know that those future generations, no matter where they're from in society, where they live, they're going to need air to breathe and water to drink and food to eat. So we know what we need to be doing despite the uncertainties of the future. And I think if we need to bring those future generations into the room, we need to expand the demos. And I think certainly I feel that if we bring those kinds of values into society, the idea of being a good ancestor, that we're going to stop dumping the crap on those future generations, this requires long struggles in education systems, religion, and so on to inculcate these kinds of values. But I'm hopeful that there are enough time rebels around the world, organizations of people who are dedicated to long-term thinking, whether it's Fridays for the Future movement, that's Svalbard Global Seed Vault, the Japanese Future Design movement, all of this stuff, everyone on this call who's come to think about a topic like this, about rethinking democracy, all of us together, we are time rebels. And I think together we can create that world for future generations. We can become good ancestors. And with that, I think I better stop. And I'm so sorry I haven't got to hear more of your voices. I should have really asked more of you to comment, but I didn't know what the format was going to be. So thank you all very much. If you've got any more questions for me at all, write to me on Twitter or something like that. I will try and answer in 280 characters or less. And I'm sorry I haven't been able to respond to all of the questions, but thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a wonderful evening and that there are great talks that you go to. I'm going to drop in some of those as well. So thank you very much. Farewell. And thank you for the little claps I can see. It's very kind.